day my old man told me to hit the road was the same day the radiator in my beat-up '94 Chevy Silverado decided to crack, spewing steam into the frigid November air like a surrender flag, marking the absolute rock bottom of my 17 years on this earth. But looking back, that breakdown was the only reason I stopped at that Greasy Spoon diner off Interstate 90, where I saw the flyer that would change my entire existence. I was sitting there, nursing a lukewarm coffee that tasted like battery acid, counting the crumpled dollar bills in my pocket, which amounted to exactly $42 and some change, feeling the weight of the world crushing my chest. Because when you're a kid in the Rust Belt with no high school diploma and a dad who thinks tough love means locking the door and changing the locks, the future looks about as bright as a burnt-out headlight. And that's when I saw it, pinned to the corkboard next to ads for lost cats and lawnmower repair services, a handwritten note on yellow legal pad paper that simply read, "Quonset hut for sale, $6, must move or take land lease, inquire within." And I remember laughing out loud, a manic, desperate sound that made the waitress look at me like I was strung out on something, because $6 wouldn't even buy you a decent burger, let alone a structure. But something about the absurdity of it, the sheer impossibility of a $6 house clawed at me, maybe because I was worth about $6 myself right then. So I asked the waitress who posted it, and she pointed a stained thumb toward a booth in the back where a guy who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and cigarette smoke was staring out the window. I walked over, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and asked him if it was a joke, and he turned to me with eyes that had seen things most people only see in nightmares, and told me it wasn't a joke. It was a burden he was unloading, because the county was breathing down his neck about zoning laws, and he was moving to Florida to die in the sunshine. So he tossed the keys on the table, rusty, heavy iron keys that looked like they belonged to a dungeon, and told me if I had 6 ones, the deed was mine, provided I took over the lease on the scrubland it sat on, which was located in a part of the state so remote that even the GPS satellites probably forgot it existed. I handed him the money, 6 crisp Washingtons I'd saved from mowing lawns, and walked out of that diner feeling like I'd just robbed a bank or signed my own death warrant. And after patching my radiator with duct tape and a prayer, I drove 3 hours into the black void of the countryside, the radio fading into static until it was just me and the sound of gravel crunching under my bald tires, leading me to a patch of dirt that looked like the surface of the moon. And there it was, my $6 empire, a rusted, corrugated steel half-cylinder rising out of the weeds like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, battered by decades of wind and neglect, with holes in the roof you could throw a football through, and a dirt floor that smelled of damp earth and decay. I stood there in the headlights, the wind cutting through my thin denim jacket, realizing I had no electricity, no running water, no heat, and no family, just a metal shell that amplified the sound of the rain starting to fall, a sound that hammered against the tin roof like 1,000 drumsticks. And for the first few nights, I huddled in the cab of my truck, terrified to go inside, because the darkness in there felt heavy, almost alive. But desperation has a way of killing fear. So on the 4th day, I took a crowbar to the jammed front door, screeching metal tearing the silence of the valley, and stepped inside my new home, sweeping out dead leaves, rat droppings, and the ghosts of whoever had abandoned this place 40 years ago. I spent my last few dollars on a tarp to cover the leaks and a second-hand kerosene heater that smelled like jet fuel, and I started to clean, scrubbing the rust, scavenging scrap wood from the surrounding woods to build a makeshift platform to sleep on. And it was during this process, while I was digging a fire pit in the center of the dirt floor to save on kerosene, that my shovel hit something hard, not a rock, but something metallic and hollow, a clang that reverberated through the soles of my boots and sent a shiver up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I scraped away the packed earth, my fingernails bleeding, the dust choking me, until I revealed a heavy iron hatch, welded shut and buried under 6 inches of soil, a secret door right in the middle of my $6 house. And I knew right then that this wasn't just a Quonset hut, it was a cover for something else, something deeper. And as I sat there staring at that hatch, exhausted, hungry, and completely alone, a crazy thought took root in my brain. A thought that I wasn't just going to live in this tin can, I was going to conquer it. I was going to break that seal and see what the previous owner had been trying to hide or trying to survive. Because when you're 17 and the world has kicked you to the curb, you realize that the only way to go is down, literally, into the belly of the earth where no one can tell you to leave. So I grabbed a sledgehammer, swung it with all the teenage angst and fury I possessed, and broke the rusted lock, the screech of the hinges sounding like a scream as I pulled the heavy lid open to reveal a ladder descending into absolute blackness, a cool draft of air hitting my face that smelled of stale oxygen and history. And I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, clamped it between my teeth, and began the climb down, marking the moment my life truly began, not just as a runaway kid, but as the king of an underground kingdom that I bought for the price of a fast food meal, unaware that what I was descending into wasn't just a basement, but a labyrinth that would consume the next 10 years of my life and turn me into a legend in these parts, the boy who built a fortress beneath a rusted piece of junk, defying the town council, the weather, and the laws of physics, all because I refused to be homeless, refused to be a statistic, and decided that if I couldn't build up, I would build down, carving out a future in the bedrock, one shovel of dirt at a time, fueled by spite and the American dream of owning something that nobody could take away from you. Dropping down that ladder felt like descending into the throat of a monster, the air growing thick and heavy with the metallic tang of old copper and the musty sweetness of dry rot. And when my boots finally hit the concrete floor with a dull thud, I swung the flashlight beam around to reveal a space that was less of a bunker and more of a concrete tomb, a 10 by 10 Cold War relic that looked like it had been poured in a panic back when everyone thought the nukes were about to fly. Empty except for a rotting wooden bench and a stack of rusted canned water that expired before I was even born. But despite the claustrophobia and the spiderwebs thick enough to catch a bat, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Because down here, 12 feet under the frost line, the biting wind that was tearing through the cracks of the Quonset hut above couldn't touch me, and the temperature was a steady, survivable 55 degrees, which gave me an idea that was equal parts genius and insanity. I decided right then that I wasn't just going to use this hole as a root cellar, I was going to turn it into a palace, a subterranean bachelor pad where I could live like a king on a pauper's budget. So I set up a base camp down there, dragging my sleeping bag and my meager supplies down the ladder, sleeping with a hammer under my pillow because the darkness played tricks on your mind, making you hear scratching sounds behind the concrete walls. But the fear was a great motivator, driving me to secure a job at a local scrapyard during the day, hauling twisted metal and stripping copper wire for under-the-table cash that I immediately reinvested into my underground obsession. I became a ghost in that town, the weird kid living in the tin can out on Old County Road. But nobody knew that every night while they were watching sitcoms in their warm living rooms, I was underground, chipping away at the earth with a pickaxe I'd found in a dumpster, literally carving out my existence one bucket of dirt at a time, hauling the soil up the ladder in 5-gallon buckets until my shoulders felt like they were on fire and my hands were permanent claws of calloused flesh, dumping the dirt in the woods to avoid suspicion, because I knew if the building inspector caught wind of an unpermitted excavation, they'd condemn my property and I'd be back on the street. I learned the hard way about structural integrity when a section of the north wall started to buckle after a heavy rainstorm, spraying wet clay into my sleeping quarters and nearly burying me alive, a terrifying wake-up call that forced me to spend 3 weeks' worth of paychecks on cinder blocks, rebar, and bags of concrete that I had to mix by hand in a wheelbarrow, sweating through my clothes in the middle of December, learning masonry from library books I read by the light of a kerosene lantern, figuring out how to pour headers and shore up the ceiling with steel I-beams I scavenged from the scrapyard, telling my boss I needed them for an art project so he wouldn't ask questions. The isolation began to change me, hardening my resolve, and as the winter dragged on and the snow piled up against the Quonset hut doors, burying me in a white tomb, I retreated fully into my bunker, running a dangerously long extension cord from a neighbor's barn, with his permission mostly, to power a single light bulb and a small space heater, creating a cozy, dim little world where I was the master and commander. And it was down there, staring at the gray concrete walls, that I sketched out the master plan on the back of a pizza box, a blueprint for a multi-room complex that would rival the Batcave, including a hydroponic garden so I'd never go hungry, and a water filtration system tapping into the local aquifer. Dreams that seemed impossible for a dropout with $40 to his name, but I was fueled by a burning hatred for the system that said you needed a mortgage and a credit score to have a home. I started expanding the tunnel to the west, aiming for a natural limestone shelf I'd read about in geological surveys of the area, thinking if I could hit that rock I'd have a natural roof that would never collapse. So I traded my pickaxe for a jackhammer I rented for the weekend, a beast of a machine that rattled my teeth and filled the tunnel with choking dust. But when I finally broke through the clay and hit solid gray stone, I let out a primal scream of victory that echoed in the small chamber, because I knew I had found the foundation for the rest of my life. I spent the next 6 months living like a mole person, surfacing only to work and buy ramen noodles, my skin turning pale, my eyes adjusting to the low light, transforming that 10 by 10 box into a 20 by 30 living room with a makeshift kitchenette powered by propane. And even though I was exhausted, filthy, and constantly on the verge of financial ruin, I had never felt more free, because every inch of that space was mine, built with my blood and sweat, a secret sanctuary where the rules of the surface world didn't apply. And just when I thought I had reached the limit of what one guy could do with a shovel and a bad attitude, I stumbled upon a rusted pipe protruding from the earth while digging the drainage sump, a pipe that didn't appear on any city map, leading me to realize that I wasn't the first person to try and hide down here, and that my $6 Quonset hut was sitting on top of a mystery that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. A mystery that would force me to upgrade my operations from simple survival to high-tech excavation, turning my bunker build into a full-blown archaeological dig for lost government secrets.
That rusted pipe wasn't just a piece of plumbing, it was a breadcrumb trail leading straight into the paranoid heart of the 1950s, and when I took a cutting torch to it, slicing through the corroded iron, a blast of pressurized air hissed out like the earth itself was sighing, carrying the distinct, sterile smell of ozone and electrical fire, which told me this wasn't a sewer line or a water main, but a conduit for something much more sophisticated. I followed the pipe's trajectory, digging like a man possessed, abandoning my plans for a living room in favor of chasing this mechanical rabbit hole, tunneling horizontally through the dense clay for nearly 20 feet until my shovel clanged against a steel bulkhead door, heavily riveted and painted a faded industrial green, stenciled with warning labels that had mostly flaked away but still screamed "authorized personnel only." And sitting there in the flickering light of my headlamp, covered in mud, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I realized my $6 investment had just paid out the lottery jackpot of intrigue. Getting that door open took me 3 days of brute force, using a hydraulic jack and enough penetrating oil to lubricate a battleship. But when the rusted tumblers finally clicked and the heavy wheels spun, the door groaned open to reveal not just another room, but a descending spiral staircase made of galvanized steel, pristine and untouched by the dampness that plagued my upper levels, leading down into a silence so profound it fell heavy on my eardrums. I descended slowly, step by echoing step, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a circular chamber lined with banks of ancient towering server racks, vacuum tubes, and reel-to-reel tape machines that looked like props from a sci-fi movie, all powered down and gathering dust, a forgotten data center from before the internet was even a glint in Al Gore's eye. Likely a localized communication hub for the civil defense network that had been shuttered and sealed when the Cold War thawed. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a time capsule of analog technology, and as I walked among the silent machines, I felt a strange kinship with the engineers who must have built this place, hiding their work beneath the unassuming shell of a Quonset hut, just like I was hiding my life beneath the same rusty roof. And that's when the entrepreneur in me woke up, realizing that while the electronics were obsolete junk, the infrastructure, the heavy-duty wiring, the industrial ventilation shafts, the reinforced concrete shell was worth a fortune if I could repurpose it. I spent the next year of my life transforming this forgotten command center into the ultimate underground workshop, stripping out the useless vacuum tubes and selling the copper and rare metals to collectors and recyclers, generating enough cash to finally upgrade my power grid from a shaky extension cord to a proper solar battery array I installed on the south side of the Quonset hut, disguising the panels as roof repairs to keep the nosy neighbors from asking why my electric bill was zero. I turned the server room into a machine shop, dragging a used lathe and a milling machine down the stairs piece by heavy piece, reassembling them with the patience of a saint. And I started taking on custom fabrication jobs, fixing tractor parts for local farmers and machining custom car parts for hot rod enthusiasts, building a reputation as the guy who could fix anything if you didn't mind dropping it off at the weird metal shed in the middle of nowhere. My bunker wasn't just a home anymore. It was a fortress of industry, soundproof and vibration isolated by 20 feet of dirt, allowing me to work at 3 a.m. with Metallica blasting at full volume while the world above slept in silence. And the money started rolling in, enough to buy better tools, better food, and finally a heavy-duty security door to replace the one I'd broken into, sealing my kingdom off from prying eyes. But success breeds curiosity, and the local sheriff started doing slow drive-bys, eyeing my renovations with suspicion, probably wondering if I was cooking meth or running a chop shop, which forced me to get creative with my camouflage, planting thick hedges and piling junk around the ventilation intakes to hide them, playing a cat-and-mouse game with the authorities, where I was the mouse with a subterranean labyrinth. I decided to connect the original upper bunker to the lower command center with a hidden hydraulic lift, scavenging parts from an old forklift so I could move heavy equipment without breaking my back on the stairs, a feat of engineering that took me 4 months of welding and cursing. But when I first rode that platform down, the smooth hum of the hydraulics echoing off the concrete walls, I felt like a Bond villain in the making, the master of my domain, untouchable and hidden. The turning point came when a massive blizzard hit the county, knocking out power for a week and burying the roads in 5 feet of snow, leaving everyone topside freezing in the dark, while down below I was sitting in my climate-controlled bunker, watching movies on a projector screen I'd painted on the wall, eating hot pizza I baked in my propane oven, warm, safe, and utterly self-sufficient. And I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, in a way that the people who had looked down on me, the teachers who said I wouldn't amount to anything, the dad who kicked me out, couldn't even comprehend. I had taken a $6 piece of trash and turned it into a nuclear-proof sanctuary, a testament to what happens when you back a desperate kid into a corner and give him a shovel. But as I sat there in my underground paradise, sipping a cold soda and listening to the wind howl impotently 30 feet above my head, I heard a new sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping coming from behind the far wall of the command center, a sound that wasn't mechanical but geological, like water rushing under immense pressure. And I knew that my exploration wasn't finished, that the Earth had one more secret to give up, one that would threaten to flood everything I had built or provide me with the ultimate resource, limitless power.
The thumping sound drove me crazy for 3 days, a low-frequency pulse that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones, until I couldn't take it anymore and grabbed the masonry drill, boring a test hole into the east wall of the command center where the noise was loudest, and the moment the bit punched through, a jet of water shot out with the force of a fire hose, knocking me backward and soaking my electronics, a terrifying realization that I had just tapped into a high-pressure underground aquifer that threatened to turn my bunker into an aquarium within minutes. I scrambled to jam a tapered wooden plug into the hole, my heart hammering against my ribs, the water rising around my ankles, cold and relentless, and as I fought against the pressure, slipping on the wet concrete, I realized this wasn't a disaster. It was an opportunity, because that much pressure meant energy. It meant I wasn't just sitting on water, I was sitting on a hydroelectric gold mine. Once I managed to seal the breach with a proper valve assembly I welded together in a panic, I spent the next month channeling that hydraulic force, building a custom turbine from an old truck alternator and some PVC pipe, a Rube Goldberg contraption that looked ridiculous, but when I finally opened the valve, spun with a high-pitched whine that sent the voltage meter on my battery bank pegging into the green, giving me free, limitless, off-grid power 24/7, rain or shine. With infinite electricity, my ambitions exploded. I installed high-intensity grow lights for a massive hydroponic garden that provided me with fresh tomatoes, peppers, and greens in the dead of winter, and I set up a high-end server rack to mine cryptocurrency, turning my excess power into digital gold that paid for my property taxes and then some, effectively making my $6 house pay me to live there. But the real victory wasn't the money or the gadgets. It was the day my dad's old truck pulled up the long gravel driveway 5 years after he'd kicked me out, the engine sputtering just like mine used to, and he walked up to the rusty Quonset hut, looking around at the desolate scrubland with a sneer, probably expecting to find me living in squalor, maybe wanting to offer a conditional truce or just gloat. I met him at the door, not as the scared kid he threw out, but as a man with dirt under his nails and a kingdom under his boots, and I invited him in, watching his eyes widen as I led him past the deceptive rusty shell, through the hidden hatch, and down into the warm, brightly lit, humming heart of my underground complex, showing him the machine shop, the hydroponics, the power plant, the living quarters that were nicer than the house I grew up in. He didn't say a word, just stared at the walls of reinforced concrete and the banks of glowing servers, the hum of the ventilation system filling the silence between us, and when he finally looked at me, the sneer was gone, replaced by a look of confusion and begrudging respect, realizing that his rejection hadn't broken me, it had forged me. I didn't ask for an apology, and he didn't offer one, but when he left that day, driving away in his fading truck, I knew the dynamic had shifted forever. I was no longer the dependent, I was the architect of my own reality. 10 years later, I still live here, though the town has grown closer and the secrets are harder to keep, but I've legally bought the mineral rights and properly permitted the structure as a storm shelter to keep the bureaucrats happy, transforming the original $6 investment into a property worth $500,000, though I'd never sell it because you can't put a price on a sanctuary. I sit down here sometimes in the silence of the lower level, listening to the turbines spin, thinking about that cold November day when I had $40 and a broken radiator, and I realized that the Quonset hut was never really the house. The house was the resilience I built inside myself, layer by layer, digging deep when the surface world offered me nothing but a cold shoulder. I'm the king of the mole people, the wizard of the wasteland, the guy who looked at a rusty tin can and saw a castle. And if there's one thing I learned from a decade underground, it's that when life tries to bury you, you don't dig your way out, you dig deeper. You fortify, and you build a world where you make the rules, lit by the power of your own stubborn refusal to quit. So, if you're driving down some forgotten highway and see a rusted piece of junk sitting in a field, don't pity the person living there, because for all you know, they're sitting on a leather couch 20 feet down, eating fresh strawberries and watching the game on a 60-inch screen, laughing at the mortgage-paying suckers driving by, just like me.